And she's beaten me.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to New York Law School. My name is Marcy Grigsby. I'm the Vice President for Institutional Advancement. So I oversee alumni relations and development, and am thrilled to be part of helping to organize this event with so many others here. I'm also a former student of Lenni Benson. She was my Civ Pro professor when I was a 1L. And so when I see the number of people who have come out tonight to help us have a substantive, important discussion, and also to celebrate her work and that of her co-authors, I am, always, I'm never surprised at the outpouring of interest in Lenni's work and of all the people that she turns out, but nevertheless, always in complete admiration. So without further ado, I'll invite Dean Crowell to come up and we'll get things started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcy. Appreciate that. And indeed, it is a really exciting evening that we've been looking forward to for actually a couple of years. And so it's a proud moment for us. So I just want to welcome everyone to New York Law School, a wonderful place that is a celebration of the work of lawyers each and every day in our efforts to ensure social justice around the world. And it's a nice evening for us to celebrate our wonderful colleague, Professor Lenni Benson, and the publication of a new book, Protecting Migrant Children in Search of Best Practice, which was co-edited by her and Mary Crock. Tonight, and this is Mary. Tonight promises to be both a wonderful celebration and a highly informative event with a panel of 5 exceptional experts led by Professor Benson. Obviously, to us, we really think of Lenni as truly one of a kind. She has had a very special year for herself personally. Happy birthday. It's been a big birthday year. And professionally. With the publication of this book and so much of her work that is of vital national interest and attention. And I should note that an announcement will be made publicly soon that she is receiving the prestigious Child 10 Award from the Hugo Stenbeck Foundation, a global children's rights group in Sweden. And that annual award is given to 10 leaders worldwide for their efforts to protect vulnerable children. So congratulations. Certainly comes as no surprise that she's receiving this honor, as she is an extraordinary scholar, leader, teacher, mentor, and advocate who has literally changed the lives of thousands of immigrant children and families. She has also changed the lives of so many New York Law School students and graduates, and really shaped the lives of many of her faculty colleagues who admire her work and follow what she does each and every day. She's launched legions of our students into highly impactful and meaningful careers in immigration law, as well as many other fields. And she's truly made New York Law School a leader in immigration law. We are at the forefront of developing the next generation of immigration lawyers, thanks in large part to Lenni's work. Our school has been exceptionally fortunate to count her as one of our own. The attendance by all of you tonight here is a testament to her effect on so many, and that's why she is so unique. And celebrating her tonight at this time in our country where immigration policy is at the forefront couldn't be timed better. She's been writing and teaching immigration law for 24 years, and in that time, what she has accomplished is truly unparalleled. From 2012 to 2015, she was the chair of the Immigration and Nationality Law Committee for the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. In 2011 to 12, she served as a consultant and researcher for the Administrative Conference of the United States, a federal agency designed to make government work better. She co-authored a comprehensive report on ways to improve removal adjudication, and that report resulted in a formal adoption of over 38 recommendations by the Administrative Conference. She also is past chair of the NYLS Immigration Law Section and past Immigration Committee chair for the ABA section on administrative law and regulatory practice. And these are just a few of her appointments and service on key national issues and in key national legal organizations. Without question, she has been at the center of every significant discussion surrounding immigration law there is. As I mentioned, she has put NYLS on the map for immigration law, establishing unique and impactful clinical programs, most prominently represented now through our Immigration Law and Litigation Clinic and our Asylum Clinic. And just as remarkable and transformative has been her founding of the Safe Passage Project. Many of our students and alumni have worked in the Safe Passage Project, and they have all become better and more effective advocates because of the experience. A number of you are here tonight, and I thank all of you for your incredible work. The growth of Safe Passage has been unprecedented. From a pro bono law project within NYLS that began in 2006 to a standalone organization operating on our campus with 22 staff members now and a network of over 400 pro bono attorneys helping more than 700 children navigate immigration proceedings. I can't think of work right now that is more important than this, fighting on behalf of children experiencing traumatic and heartbreaking situations. Safe Passage is doing truly life-saving work, and we are so proud that Safe Passage considers NYLS its home. Professor Benson is truly relentless in her advocacy on their behalf and the entire diverse community of immigrants. As a member of our faculty, she is a prolific scholar, both in her writings and with how in demand she is as a go-to immigration law expert in the national media. There's no one better to explain the law, the stakes, and the human dimensions to the general public than Lenni Benson. And that's why I am so proud that we will soon celebrate her appointment to a new faculty chair in immigration. As a member of our faculty, there's no one more invested in developing our students so they can make an immediate impact as new lawyers. She's mentored legions who all remain friends and colleagues to her as they advance in their careers. And because they appreciate the impact she had on their lives and careers, these NYLS alums give back themselves, mentoring new generations of students, helping them to develop professionally and to gain access to the same opportunities they had. That includes Claire Thomas, who's on the panel from our class of 2011, who is an adjunct professor here directing our asylum clinic. Claire leads students in providing representation to refugees seeking asylum from dire situations and is a leader in the immigration law community herself. And thanks to Professor Benson and those she has guided, like Claire, there are so many lawyers in immigration law who have had the right experience, a high level of compassion, and a unique understanding of the complicated sets of issues facing their clients. So Lenni's impact continues to be profound. In fact, at our gala next Thursday, November 15th, we are celebrating one of our alumni who was launched into their business immigration law career thanks in part to Lenni's mentorship. Her name is Julie Muniz of the class of 1997. And speaking of our gala, we are privileged to be joined by one of last year's gala honorees, a groundbreaking legal advocate and alumna, NYLS Board of Trustees member, Sybil Shainwald, from the class of 1976. Sybil is deeply committed to supporting Lenni's work and the immigration work she is doing with her NYLS colleagues and students. Sybil has been wonderfully generous to Safe Passage and our law school's immigration work, and she understands the magnitude of the challenge. That's because her own work as a global pioneer has been, for over 3 decades, as a relentless fighter for women's health. She has litigated on behalf of women over dangerous, defective, but widely used contraceptive and health products, and she has transformed class action litigation by extending the statute of limitations extended in New York. And she has litigated thousands of other cases involving drugs and devices harmful to women and their children. Her impact and legacy can be seen everywhere, from New York to Bangladesh. And in Professor Benson, she sees the same passion to help as many people as possible within the most vulnerable populations. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Sybil Shainwald up to the podium to speak. Sybil? Okay, you're set.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here on Lenni's birthday. It is a pleasure to be a supporter of Safe Passage. one of the best organizations in the world. We are here tonight to honor a woman, a pioneer, who has saved the lives of children through the Safe Passage Project, which she founded at New York Law School. She and her team are our heroes in the fight against our anti-immigration policy of the Trump administration. President Trump would not agree with Lenni's activities. And in fact, 2 weeks before the midterm elections, he began railing against the caravan, which he claimed was filled with gangsters, drug dealers, and ISIS. He has threatened to send 15,000 troops to keep these migrants from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador from entering the U.S. These are people who are seeking asylum, and it should be noted that the flow of immigrants today is a quarter of what it was in 2000, and is composed of men, women, and children fleeing countries because they are threatened. Now more than ever, we need lawyers and the people of the country who are willing to stand up for the helpless. We must follow Lenni's lead and support her. Lenni has asked me to say something about myself, which I find very difficult. To paraphrase Confucius, she who speaks without modesty will find it difficult to make her words good. However, nobody disobeys Lenni Benson. I was born a feminist. I was born an advocate. The struggle for women's rights was one of the great movements of the 20th century and continues to have a great impact on society. Since receiving my law degree in 1976, I have been a champion for women's health. For me, the law has always been a way to combat injustice and an opportunity to right wrongs and not a source of profit. I have focused my legal career, as you heard, exclusively on women's health because I believe that women have suffered irreparable damage at the hands of corporate America. I have fought for recognition, compensation, and regulations that would protect future generations. We all know that Lenni is the founder of the Safe Passage Project, which began in 2006 as a small pro bono organization representing immigrant youth, supervising students and attorneys at U.S. Immigration Court, and she now mentors many attorneys who appear in state and federal courts and tribunals. The Safe Passage Project today is both a clinic here at New York Law School and a growing nonprofit serving over 800 migrant youth. Lenni is, of course, qualified in the federal courts as an expert witness. She has spoken and written on many subjects, especially on access for justice for migrant children, and has focused on the unmet needs of Central American migrants and due process protection for children. Her travels have taken her from Sydney, Australia, to Southampton, New York, and to the White House. She has made films, written extensively on immigration reform, moderated numerous panels, and been a participant in several symposia. For the last few weeks, our current president and his conservative allies have operated largely in tandem on social media and elsewhere to push alarming conspiratorial warnings about the migrant caravan more than 1,000 miles from our border. They have tried to have voters rally around the idea that foreign nationals pose a threat to our country's security, stability, and identity. The president described the caravan as an invasion of our country, and he threatened that he would deploy approximately 5,200 active duty troops to the southern border. The other thing, of course, that he's done is to say by executive order that children born of immigrant parents are not citizens of the United States. He thinks that he can issue an executive order to change the Constitution. So We are hardly being overrun by illegal immigrants. The estimated number in this country has fallen since 2008. The border is as secure as it possibly can be, with a rich country on one side and a poor country on the other side. But Mr. Trump has his idea of what makes America great. But what really makes America great is that anyone can cross the border and become a citizen. What is more important than protecting children? We are all the children of immigrants. As Lenni points out, children seeking admission to the U.S. have very few, in the book, which I recommend and to be a #1 bestseller. It's heavy, but it's good. Seeking admission to the U.S. children have very few statutory or constitutional rights. Until the passage of legislation in 2008, children had no greater statutory protections than any other non-citizen seeking admission to this country. Together with her co-editor, Professor Mary Crock, they have produced a book which should help policy leaders and government officials adopt the best practices in evaluating the claims of migrant children. Tonight, we are going to learn a bit more about her research. Trump, quite literally, bet the house on anti-immigration fear, and he lost it. It is a tragic humanitarian crisis that we are facing, but it is not a mob threatening the stability of this country, and our president is wrong to inflame and exploit the fear of immigrants. There are billions of desperately poor people all over the world. The president's latest executive order takes away citizenship from babies, as I mentioned, born here to immigrant parents. I think he should get a new lawyer, and her name is Lenni Benson. I am proud that I am a supporter of New York Law School and the works of its immigration clinics. I hope you will join the work by volunteering and making a donation. As the Hebrew sages say, to save a life is to save the world. Lenni Benson has been eminently successful in saving the world. Thank you. Now
we go?
Yes. So I want to present to you. I didn't forget, Lenni. I want to present to you our heroine, our hero, our leader, Lenni Benson, on her birthday.
Thank you, Sybil, very much. I'm going to let the renowned, famous, talented writer and journalist Julia Preston take over the show.
I'm Julia Preston. I'm a writer on immigration at the Marshall Project. I was the national immigration correspondent for the New York Times for 20 years. I'm very pleased to be here. In addition to Lenni and Claire and Mary is a professor of public law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Sydney. She's a co-editor with Lenni of the book. And we also have Isabel Martinez, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and Pamela Goldberg, who's a consultant and a former protection officer for the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, UNHCR. So let's go right to it. So Mary, let's start with you. To what extent is child migration limited to the United States, or are we talking about a global phenomenon here? What's different in the US? And how have countries responded in light of existing international conventions and laws? Is it just the US that's having this experience?
Well, first of all, Julia, I would like to, I think, join the other panelists in thanking New York Law School for running this marvellous event. I'm a bit biased when it comes to my dear friend Lenni Benson, but the reason we did this book is that this is not just a phenomenon that's limited to the United States. I began work on migrant children actually in 2004, so a long time ago, and I've got to say that one of the things that actually hasn't changed since then is that the data on migrant children is radically unreliable. Not enough research is done into this, and I welcome the work that the Safe Passage Project does in trying to both assist children but also keep track of what's going on. And it's not getting any easier. Even the regulations and announcements made today has made it harder. But what we do know is that the last guesstimate is that there are about 70 million persons displaced at the moment by disaster, armed conflict and other human catastrophes, that over half of those are children, that about 22 million are refugees. Now, what I have found extraordinary about the US situation, now this is a situation, as I said, that is global. For example, in Sweden, little Sweden, at the moment they count 65,000 unaccompanied migrant children in their care. But when I started, it was a project that involved looking at the US, the United Kingdom and Australia. We counted about 4,000 arriving in the UK, 5,000 each year unaccompanied children intercepted at the border here. Do you know, 10 years on from that, in 2014, the numbers were tenfold that. We're now looking between 50,000 and 70,000 unaccompanied children apprehended at the border, which is not counting the children who are coming with families or are otherwise in the country. I don't need to tell you about what is happening in terms of the deliberate policies to separate families that arrive together. The children have been separated. That made headlines all over the world. And I think we have the journalists to thank, indeed, for a lot of the work in letting us know what's happening on the ground. Now, how are countries responding? Well, we know how they should be responding. This book actually sets out quite beautifully, I think, the international law, the regional human rights norms that have developed, and then the in-country laws. The practice on the ground, however, sadly, I think countries everywhere have preferred deterrence, sometimes very punitive measures, over the protection of children. And so we are seeing a global, not just here, but a global addiction to mandatory immigration detention. And I know that a lot of what's going on here is trying to become more like Australia. I believe that one of the first people that your President Trump called when he assumed his office was our then Prime Minister. We changed them every couple of years, you know, who he called Mr. Trumbull. It was Mr. Turnbull. And when he got talking to him, and our Prime Minister explained that we have this policy of if you come by boat, we'll send people to remote desert islands. They've been there 7 years. The children born there are 7 years old. They're developing catatonic conditions. And finally, Australians are saying enough, bring them here. And I hope they will all be, the children at least, will be in Australia by Christmas. But you know what Trump's comment was? Oh, he said, after he'd said the deal to take some of Australia's refugees is the worst deal ever, he said, you know, you're worse than I am. And to a certain extent, he's right. So it's a global phenomenon. Our countries are talking to each other, they're sharing policies. And I think while everybody would claim that the protection of migrant children is good in theory, unfortunately the policies we are developing punishes the embodied child.
Is there a body of international law that should be governing this, or that countries are looking to guide their creation of child protection?
In fact, the international human rights law relating to children is the strongest law there is in the global panoply of human rights laws. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has been subscribed to by all but one country in the world, Convention on the Rights of the Child, actually collects and formalises all of the human rights and makes them mandatory, and it's built around really two principles: that the best interests of the child shall be a right, a principle, and a rule of procedure. Now, before you get too depressed by the fact that the US is the only country that hasn't signed on to the CRC, as we call it, in fact, one of the reasons you haven't is that your laws domestically acknowledge at least many of the principles enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But we have a whole suite. We've got 10 human rights instruments now, including Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I think the second, I said the best interest of the child is one principle. The second principle that set the CRC apart and makes it a revolutionary document is that they said, in all matters concerning children, that the child must be allowed to participate and have their say. So in many ways, I think that these new international instruments adopt what I would call a capabilities approach, acknowledging that human rights actually requires us to look at the embodied person, the embodied child, and to deal with that child as they are, not according to whether they, by assisting them, we might be encouraging others to engage in dangerous border crossings. International law, I think, tells us that we have to think about the embodied child first.
And one more question. This International Convention on the Rights of the Child, is that reflected in American immigration law to the same extent that it is in American domestic law or family law?
Unfortunately, the US is not alone in this. The status of the child too often is trumped by the status of the migrant. And I think...
The migrant being the parent or the
Well,
the
a
adult?
child's status as a migrant. So in other
I see.
words, if, having said that, can I say that there is at least one aspect of US law that I find very promising and that we have to put in the best practice basket, and that is the recognition that a child coming without a parent, without a relative to support and protect them, if they are classed as special immigrant juveniles, they can be given a green card, given permanent status here. That's really good. In Europe, the international and regional human rights frameworks have led countries to recognise that if a child is recognised as a child that is under the age of 18, they shall be protected up until the age of 18. So that's very good practice. In the UK, for example, they have a status called exceptional leave to remain in the country. Fantastic while the child is a child, but what happens after they turn 18? So the special immigrant juvenile justice status in the US, I think, is very good because it actually recognises this child needs protection now, and let's just have done with it and give them a green card and let them become wholesome adults and participate and move into our community. So that's I think, one thing that the rest of the world could take away. I've been arguing since at least 2007 that we should do exactly that, without a great deal of success, but I will keep trying.
Lenni, what are the most significant obstacles and difficulties that children face when they migrate. And could you detail for us what you see as the most significant deficiencies in American law in terms of the protections of migrant children?
So I'm going to save my thank yous to the end, if that's all right. And just everyone in this room, you know that I'm thanking you for being here, including our panel. To me, the biggest danger and the biggest obstacle is, in fact, danger. Parents, young people in their own decision-making, their own freedom, they may say life will be better in the United States, life will be better in Sweden, life will be better if I can just leave Syria. Parents have imperfect information. Our shrinking world, because of the facility of global communication, makes it possible for someone to Instagram, Facebook, tweet, and see, there's my cousin, my third cousin once removed, my friend from the football team, the soccer team. There he is living happy and healthy in Berlin. There is my friend in middle school in Queens. And of course, what does our social media world show? Usually only the best, the safest, the most cheerful. And there are a lot of misconceptions, but this is old. Children who came to the United States from 1890 to 1922, when we first passed our national quota laws, they too came with ideas of the streets are paved with gold, life will be better here, I'll be able to eat every day, I'll be able to go to school. And in the memory of my own grandparents, and perhaps some of your great-grandparents, it is true that they often went to bed hungry, or had to leave school, or had to work very hard. So one of the obstacles I worry about for children is the migration patterns themselves, and often the immigrant-on-immigrant exploitation. So it is that justifies many of the nations of the world, as Professor Crock has said briefly, and Australia certainly has adopted, and our government often adopts this rhetoric of, we want to protect these children, and the way to protect children is to create harsh, unforgiving, absolutist immigration laws and to detain. In fact, if you feel like going on one of my favorite websites, thank you, Camille Broussard in the library for teaching me about it, thomas.gov, which is where you can read about proposed legislation and see the status of bills. The bills that many members of Congress, mostly in the Republican Party, but not universally, have been introducing to handle child migration say things like Save Our Children Act, or Safe Child Protection Act, when in essence what they want to do is apprehend the child, put them in detention, perhaps deny them an immigration hearing, and then repatriate as absolutely quickly as possible. They will tell you they're doing that to protect the child from exploitation, from trafficking, and from being an incentive for more children to come. So that whole dynamic of governments being worried that fair treatment and cautious adjudication and giving children time to have their voice as required by international law will incentivize more to come and abuse the law. I have an easy answer for that. I believe our Constitution and our American United States traditions fall on the side of giving a person an opportunity to be heard in their day in court. And the Constitution does say no person shall be deprived due process of law, whereas in many other provisions it does limit the right to a particular status. So what is the US doing? I think that is particularly worse. I could go on a long list, right? I mean, what time is it? It does feel, there's so many experts in this room, I think I could just point out and say, Jody, separated children this summer that dismantled all the work you were doing with children in detention, or some of the immigration judges in the room who've been now given a quota, and it doesn't matter how complex the case or how difficult the application, they're supposed to make a decision in rapid time. Or some of the lawyers here who are in family court and have seen a growing rejection of our state family court adjudication of dependency because our government is challenging state court family court adjudications. So what is our government doing that's the worst, though, the single worst thing? Well, we're in a law school, and you're not going to be surprised I'm going to say this, but I believe this with all my heart. If you have children that are represented, they succeed. Now, Safe Passage Project does that by and large through its excellent staff mentoring pro bono lawyers. And then I see many of you out there, I'm just going to shout out Greg. You take a case, you do another one. You take a case, you do another one. Then you start teaching another one of the pro bonos. That's the model. We share the education, the knowledge, the experience. I believe that the court and the government appreciate us, and I need to say hi, Judge Rowan, who got me involved in all of this. It is unbelievable to children when I speak at a high school, or to college students when I speak at a college, to say you don't have a right to a lawyer even though you're detained, you're facing deportation, and you've just made one of the most harrowing journeys in your life, and you most likely are a victim of some kind of abuse or persecution that is leading to your migration. So the worst, not giving children the right to counsel. Enough? You don't want me to keep going, do you? We could be here all night.
So we're going to talk about best practices at the end, so
Okay.
we'll
We'll come back to the
we're gonna
cheerful.
try, and even in this environment, we're going to try and end on an upbeat note. My question then for Isabel is, just talk about migration from Central America. Is this new? Are we
No.
seeing, is this picture,
No.
have we seen this picture before?
Yes. And I'm actually going to expand it a little bit back, if that's okay. 'Cause my
Yeah.
chapter
Give us
deals with the Americas in general. And so I'm going to take us back 200 years, actually, where we see the roots of what is happening today taking place in the early 1800s. And we see a cycle over and over again of displacement that has pushed children, adults and children, and I focus on Mexico and Central America, from their homelands to the United States. So if you go back with me to the early 1800s, we see in the 1822, different countries in Latin America declaring independence. The United States was a model for this. Many Latin American countries were looking to the United States as the model for this, and declaring their independence from different European countries, Spain, Portugal, etc. 1 year later, we have the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe, basically, I think seeing some opportunity, looks at the Americas and wants to prevent any more European intervention into the Americas. And basically, in the Monroe Doctrine, one of the big pieces is saying, Europe, hands off of the Americas. What they don't say is, we will keep the hands off of the Americas, right? And so that, I think, really, I mean, if you really want to talk about this, and then we see 20 years later, Manifest Destiny, which most people talk about, I think, in the westward expansion in the United States. I tend to think of it as well as a southern expansion into the Americas. This ideology that the United States has a God-given right to fight for territorial expansion, both physical and ideological. And I think from there we start seeing, and I look at, I say 4.5 cases because I introduced my grandmother. I'm the daughter of a granddaughter of an unaccompanied minor from Mexico, where you see different points of displacement and violence happening across Mexico and Central America. I start with the Mexican Revolution. At the time of the Mexican Revolution in 1910 to 1920, we see 1/4 of Mexican lands owned by American investors and corporate interests. Maybe you've heard of these names: Russell Sage, J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, and you see them in dialogue and with the Mexican government, at that time a dictator, buying up lands that are mostly the lands in which indigenous folks and the poor and rural folks are living, buying them up to start laying down tracks for railroads, start expanding agricultural industries. And so you begin to see what I think is the root issue of this migration, this displacement, whether it's done because of economic reasons or political reasons, but you start to see it there, right? So 1910, my grandmother arrived in 1918. Fast forward 30 years, 20 years, 30 years, 1942, 1964, we have the Bracero program here in the United States. And with Mexico, it was seen really as a safety valve program to alleviate a pressure that was building in Mexico from a lot of surplus labor that was a result of massive repatriations of Mexican workers from the United States, in coinciding with, which, you know, good thing, modernization policies that were US backed to raise birth rates, what do you call it, life expectancy and literacy levels. Great, that's awesome. But what doesn't happen is we don't see an expansion of the labor market. We don't see an expansion of agricultural industries to be able to feed these people who are living longer and returning. And so again, you're seeing this pressure building up and the need for people, in this case young people, to help feed their families. And you see actually some braceros lying about, or leaving and arriving into the United States and then returning to enter into the bracero program. And you also see some young people lying about their age to enter into the bracero program, all to feed their families.
So
I'm getting to Central America.
let's go to Central America.
I am. So Central America, I mean, we can, if you look at El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduran history, we see, again, a 20th century phenomenon of intervention from the United States starting in 1910, 1920s, and sort of this back and forth interventions in each of those countries. I think one of the most, the starkest, or where we really can see Central American unaccompanied minor migration happening, was during the Civil Wars in 1980 to 1992. But even preceding this, we see the United States intervening and backing government officials who will allow the United States come in. Again, around displacement, allow corporations to come in. I mean, I think the discussion in the 1980s was around fending off communism, which again was tied back to the Monroe Doctrine. We don't want this foreign, this time the Soviet Union and Cuba, intervening in the Americas. We're going to ward off communism. But it was about also displacement of indigenous folks and rural folks that we see today. And so, you know, looking at 1980 and 1992, we saw large numbers of unaccompanied minors arriving here. Should I stop there?
Yeah.
Okay. I can
That's
go.
great, though.
It's a great chapter.
It's
You have to
fabulous
read
chapter.
it.
It's a great chapter, and it starts with the 100+ descendants of your.
Oh, yes. I have a very large family now. I'm third generation.
It was your great grandmother?
My grandmother.
Your grandmother. Yeah. So now this family is now 100 strong in this country. So it's a great chapter. Claire.
Yeah.
So we're getting to the contemporary situation with migrant children. The United States is currently offering different possibilities to children who arrive without a parent or a legal guardian, and to children who migrate with their families.
Sure.
And maybe you could describe that a little bit and what the impact of that has been. And I have a question about that,
Okay.
which is, that maybe you can address, which is the unaccompanied minor system, the shelter system.
Yes.
Has that been a magnet? Has that drawn
Okay.
unaccompanied, has that drawn young people from Central America particularly to come to the United States?
Okay, great. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. I, like Lenny, will save all of that till the end. But effectively, what we're talking about is unaccompanied children versus accompanied children. And we have actually different legal definitions, right? So that children who arrive in the United States are referred to as unaccompanied children, meaning that when they arrive or they have no lawful immigration status in the United States, they have not attained 18 years of age, and also for whom there's no parent or legal guardian in the United States in their physical custody at that time. So effectively, those children who are labeled as unaccompanied children, right there, right, usually at time of apprehension, which would be southern or northern border, here we're talking about southern border, are actually treated differently than the children who are seen as accompanied children, meaning the children who still are under the age of 18, but who are arriving with usually mom or dad or with someone who has been designated as their legal guardian. For the accompanied children, with the exception of this summer in family separation and the horrors that ensued of effectively stripping the forcible separation of children from their parents, making accompanied children into unaccompanied children, we had different legal protections, right, for the unaccompanied children, meaning that these children were able to file their asylum cases at the asylum office, have their asylum cases heard at the asylum office in first instance, as opposed to an adversarial trial proceeding in immigration court, right? There were certain age-out protections for asylum as well that the children who are designated as accompanied children might not receive. Also differences in terms of funding for nonprofit service providers in terms of who could represent whom, right? And in terms of access to counsel, right, you also have vastly different outcomes for those cases as well. So to address your further question, Julia, in terms of if ORR being the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which here effectively has nothing to do with resettlement or with refugees, but acts as the social workers, acts as the only federal agency under the Federal Department of Health and Human Services that had the capacity to deal with kids, right? Because nobody else wanted to. If that whole idea of kid detention or the child shelter system works as a magnet, in my opinion, from what I read, I don't think so. And to build off of what Lenni and Isabel were referring to, what the press often says is this idea of why are they coming, right? Why are, quote unquote, these people coming to the United States? And I'd like to rephrase that in terms of actually why are they leaving home, right? Instead of why are they coming here, why are people living home? And there is no better person to do that than the poet Warsan Shire, who is a British Somali poet who I will just read a few lines of her poem. And it is no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land, right? To be left with an impossible choice is not a reason for coming, it is a reason for leaving. And until there is an understanding of why people are leaving home, right? We don't fully address what is going on in the home country. We don't address the reasons for migration, the dangerousness of the journey, right? All what my colleagues talked to you about. But why is it that a 12, a 13-year-old, or a baby would be forced to leave home? So I don't think per se that it is a magnet, right? But it is the idea that there are people in vulnerable positions for which home is no longer an option.
The Trump administration is seeking to create a situation where they can prolong the detention of children if they are accompanied by a parent. Sure. So after the family separation crisis of the summer, their response to not having further family separation is to have family detention.
Sure.
And what would be the impact? I mean, is this a good idea? What would be the impact on the children of if they're detained with their parent? Is that such a bad thing?
Sure. The short answer is yes, that is a bad thing. And just to explain that a little bit further, we have the idea of family detention, while you'll have it referred to as the idea of a summer camp or something like that by rather, in my opinion, callous government officials. Detention is the deprivation of liberty. It is jail. I have twice volunteered at the quote-unquote baby jail, right, in Dilley, Texas, which I know a lot of people in this room have been at. The youngest person I advocated for was 5 months old. Right? He was actually born in Brazil. His parents were from Afghanistan. He was separated from his father, and he and his mother, who was 21, were detained. While they passed their credible fear interview, so that's the first step in the asylum process, because of the national security issues apparently posed by a 21-year-old woman and her 5-month-old baby, they were kept in detention for the pendency of the immigration case, which meant a detained trial in immigration court, right? So that baby spent I'd say another additional 3 or 4 months, right, in detention. What long-term effects that little person will have, I have no idea, right? But the whole idea of what medical science tells us is that any amount of time in detention is extremely detrimental to children. In Dilley, for instance, we as volunteers were told that the water was not potable, meaning you couldn't drink it, right? We cooked, we washed our cooking utensils, we made coffee with bottled water. The water that was given to the women, the children, the babies, the nursing mothers, was tap water, right? We watched the staff of the private prison corporation that runs the detention center fill it up from the tap. So in terms of medical care being non-existent, right, sexual assault also occurs in detention facilities, right? We have that documented in convictions as well. In terms of the Berks County Residential Facility or jail, legal counsel is always more difficult to find in detention, and basic information is hard to come by. So the idea that indefinitely detaining, or the idea of detaining, right, children is always problematic. And so whether that should be in case, I'd like to say no, and also apparently 66,000 people agree with me because there were 66,000 comments posted on the Federal Register as of when it closed, right, the comment period, the 60-day notice and comment period closed oh my gosh, this week, sorry, it's been a long week. In general, right, people posting comments saying that they also did not agree with this proposed change to indefinitely detain families through the pendency of their proceedings. So thanks to medical science, right, thanks to trauma specialists, psychiatrists, child development experts, lawyers, right, there's a unanimous agreement that any period of confinement of detention, whether or not they're with their parents or not, is detrimental to the welfare of children.
Pamela, has the United States done anything, either President Obama or President Trump, to take steps that could have a positive impact on migration flows? And if so, what was the outcome of that? And maybe you could finish your comments by talking a little bit about the caravan and that's marching northward towards the border, and with and how you see the role of the children in that caravan?
Yes, I can talk. Let me say that in the main, no, there has been very little, if anything, positive under the Trump administration. And I will, with some reluctance, I will say also there was not a whole lot of positive efforts under Obama. He did implement one program called, well, not he, but his administration, the Central American Minors Program. Very, very tiny remedy for, well, a huge remedy, but that would allow a very small number of children to come into this country as refugees under very stringent eligibility requirements that would have allowed them to be processed in their home countries abroad from the three countries we've been talking about in the Northern Triangle of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Very few children, and the requirements, among the many requirements, they had to establish eligibility for asylum in a situation where they're in their home country. Often just presenting oneself to seek asylum in the home country can make that person a target for having stepped forward, for criticizing the government or the forces that are leading to that person's fear. So there's a certain amount of danger in both getting to the place to apply and in trying to obtain that remedy. Very few children were ever allowed in under that program. Even among those who were granted, a number of them didn't make it in due to the background checks and the paperwork and all the rest of it. When Trump first took office in 2017, he rather surreptitiously abandoned that program altogether. And it didn't come out until later on, and towards the end of 2017, that he had stopped implementing that program altogether. I'm not sure the exact numbers. It was a few hundred children who came in. They had to have parents in the U.S. who had some form of lawful status. They didn't have to be lawful permanent residents or citizens, but they had to have some kind of lawful permanent status. And I don't recall the numbers anymore. I didn't have a chance to check them. But out of the Central Americans in the U.S., the huge majority of them do not have lawful status. And that brings me to, I want to come back to what the one thing Trump has done that's positive, but I want to first talk about
because both Isabel and Claire spoke so eloquently about the root causes and the reasons why these children are coming, and adults. I want to be even more explicit. There are huge numbers of criminal actors, coordinated cartels, gangs. We think of the term gang violence. You think of like the hoods in the neighborhood kind of thing. That's not what gangs are in Central America. Gangs in Central America are huge. They often have control over whole areas, and in some cases even whole towns, where the mayor can't do anything without checking it through the gang for fear that the mayor will be subject to retaliation, for example. So they operate, many of them operate not as part of the huge drug cartels, but in collaboration or in coordination with them. So they will curry favor for the bigger drug cartels and criminal organizations to get favor for things they want to do in their neighborhoods or in their communities. They are violent. They use forcible recruitment of young boys and young men. They do forcible recruitment of young women and of girls, and often the way those girls are recruited is by gang rapes. They enact terrible violence in their communities. They threaten people, including government officials in some instances. There have been instances where someone has gone forward to complain to the police or have tried to bring a case in criminal court where the police have been targeted for having carried out an investigation, or a judge has been targeted for having tried to intervene, and in some cases murdered. So it's not a small thing. Yes, there is lack of economic opportunity. There's lack of educational opportunity due to extreme poverty. There is just the desire for a better life. But there is also extreme danger in many of these communities for many of these people. And the government, there's a huge amount, well, let's not say huge, there's a large amount of collaboration or of support or of actual condemnation of the activities of the gangs. There's also a tendency to look the other way about this violence. And again, there are people in situations, police officers and other people involved with the government who are simply afraid to take any action. There have also been instances where the person who has come to the police to complain has been targeted and murdered, even where no police action was ever even taken. The other form of violence that is rampant and that often exists contemporaneously with the gang-related violence is domestic violence. And Latin America has been documented as one of the countries in the world with the highest rate of domestic violence. Region of the world with the highest rate of domestic violence. And these countries in Central America, violence begets violence. And these countries in Central America are among those with high rates of domestic violence. And the same thing has happened for women who have come forward either to try to protect themselves or to try to protect their children. There has been retaliation, there has been violence, there has been murder, there have been threats. So these are not just small things like, oh, we want to have steak for dinner. I want to go to college and I can't afford it in Guatemala, so I'll just go to the US. They are dire circumstances that people are fleeing.
So I think
Yes.
we can leave it there, but I think we perhaps should note that one of the principal legacies of the Attorney General who retired under duress was a decision that made it much more difficult for people fleeing from domestic abuse, sexual violence, and particularly gang violence to win an asylum claim in the United States. We have a few more minutes, and I was wondering, since the book is about best practices, I'm wondering maybe Lenni and Mary, you could share one best practice each?
Go first, Mary.
Well, I've mentioned one aspect of American law that I think is very promising with the special immigrant juvenile visa. I personally would like to see America recognise that not only are these children fleeing from very dire situations in Central America, but they're coming to America because their family is here. And I think family is really a big elephant in the room. Some talk has been had about adopting what they call the Colombo plan or the Columbia plan for Central America. I think best practice all around the world involves peacekeeping and peacemaking. And you're seeing that at various levels in different countries. Best practice, I think you'd probably have to look north from here to Canada, to a country that is very respectful of the rule of law and the rule of international law. But even there, human rights it's not a destination, it's a way of travelling. And I think the most important thing for all of us to realise is that life is a struggle, and achieving justice is a struggle always. And for me, what keeps me going is the fact that, like Lenni, I'm an academic, but I'm also a practitioner. I have a pro bono practice. I actually started the first community legal centre in Australia for people with migration problems, and I'm incredibly proud of Refugee Legal today. It's the biggest such organisation in Australia, and I think in part because of our work, they've made a particular focus on refugee children. So you are an example of best practice. You are an example of the hope that we have, because, you know, there's no country is perfect without the advocates, without really good lawyers for the students in the room. The best you can do is get a really good law degree, as you will in this law school, because whatever you do, whether you go into government or whether you go into an advocacy role, we need more people of goodwill who actually understand and know the law and have the moral fortitude to actually stand up to see that it is observed.
So I was thinking, Mary gave me time to think. The book is In Search of Best Practice. It did take us...
There must be something.
Yeah, it did take us more than 2 years from the conception to the production of the book. Books take a long time. For example, if you read the book, you're not going to find a discussion of family separation because that occurred long after all of us had written. So I'm going to just say two things. One is a program that Pamela didn't get a chance to really talk about, was that UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, recognizing this need for a gap filler, a negotiator, a navigator, an arbiter for children in the region, was hoping to create more robust opportunities and protections for children in that region to find refugee resettlement. And we do have to admit that the US and Canada, and sometimes Australia, are generous countries in affirmatively finding people and bringing them to the United States. But I then started thinking, well, surely there must be something. We've had so much success in the advocacy work we've done, in our legal representation. Every lawyer in this room and some of the judges and even some people who've been in the government could tell about some rule of procedure or process that allowed a child's voice to be heard, that allowed an application to be considered, that allowed an opportunity for my students and I with clipboards in the hallway to greet a child who was unrepresented and link them to counsel. But every single example I was going to give you has been either gutted or dismantled, really, by the current administration. And so I have a piece coming out soon called Administrative Chaos, in which one of the things I'm going to fall back on, and I think all of us will have to, is our federal courts applying the rule of law and the Administrative Procedure Act, and our state's attorney generals, who have been willing to recognize the needs of the families, the needs of the children, and have been writing amici briefs, filing their own actions, trying to stem lawlessness and disregard of both statutory and regulatory protections. Claire mentioned the huge 100 of pages of regulations about detention. It would not just allow, just to give you some idea, not just the detention of children with their parents, it would also create a new, quote, tribunal within this agency, Health and Human Services, that would be attorney hearing officers, no procedure set out, deciding whether or not a child could remain indefinitely in detention with all the burden of proof on the child, with limited review inside the agency to a single acting assistant secretary of the issue in Health and Human Services. That particular person right now is the person who has been delaying the release of children all across the country. We have 13,000 unaccompanied minors at least, and there's probably more in detention right now. And part of it is every time the agency is recommending release, that person is saying, that one person in Washington is saying, I need to sign off. I also need to okay whether that person can have important medical treatment, including, as you may know, access to the medical procedure called abortion. So those regulations and this creation of a lawless tribunal is one of the darkest moments I can remember in administrative law. But the bright thing, a best practice that the US does have, and I believe Canada has, and the UK has, and at times Australia has had, is access to our courts to enforce the government to protect fundamental rights that are enshrined in our statutes. Which boils down to my first point, I'm going to finish here. We need lawyers. We need all of you. Did we want to stop at this point?
Yeah, let's take some questions.
Okay, so there's microphones there in the
Please,
middle.
yeah, come to the microphone, and you can just line up at the microphone if you want to ask a question. And please tell us your name and your affiliation.
Hi, my name is Wendy Ruther, and I have no affiliation, but this is a passion of mine to help. This is really a little bit, but I want to follow up with the Central American issue, because are there any groups, nations working on improving the situation in Central America, or is it just so lawless that there's no people working on helping?
Well, I can start on that, and I'm sure others have more ideas, but as Lenni mentioned, the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, is working on the ground with governments, with non-governmental organizations, community organizations, and the children and adults themselves who are facing the fear, to try to build institutions, to try to enhance protections. These are costly, dealing with root causes of this kind of violence and harm that's so entrenched in the history of these countries, cannot be done without great effort and great cost. And there are a lot of organizations, both locally in the countries and internationally from around the world, that are working on the ground to help with these things. But one of the things Trump said about the caravan is that, well, if they try to come, I'm just going to cut aid to those countries. Now, the aid that our country gives to those countries, those three countries, goes to things like building infrastructure for justice, training judges, training police officers, helping to combat corruption, the exact kinds of things that are prime motivators. So just another indicator of the intellectual competency of our current regime. But I'll leave it at that and see if others want to.
Maybe we'll just take another question, I think, if that's all right.
Did you want
Or did you want to, Isabel? We'll wait. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
James Frankie, alumni. Yes. So I realize this is a loaded question, but as the holidays come up and I have to go home to like a conservative family and sort of.
Could you speak closer to the
Sure,
microphone?
sure. So as the holidays come up and I have to sort of go home with conservative family members, sort of explain, defend immigration and why it's important. And again, I understand this is loaded, but what's going to eventually come around is they'll talk about the caravan and then they'll tell me what I think what I think should be done if what Trump is suggesting is wrong. And so what is a good policy for that?
I'm going to jump here and say, first of all, the caravan is not new. There have been groups of people banding up periodically to travel safely. What is in part causing the caravan has been the federal government's policies for the last 10 years, where we've been paying Mexico extraordinary amounts of money to make it even more difficult to transverse Mexico. In 1 year, after 2014, when we saw the biggest spike in unaccompanied children, suddenly Mexico deported 72,000 children back to the three-country region. And then their own Senate told them they had to stop because they were violating their own domestic law and violating international law. I believe last year 16 people got asylum in Mexico. So the caravan is in part because our government has made it, we've given money to speed up their trains and have their police and make their deportation process more robust. So people are traveling in caravan rather than putting their lives in the hands of very dangerous smugglers. As Claire so beautifully put and others have said, it is the push factors, and the metaphor I like to use is ancient Egypt. What would you do if you saw the announcement is all the firstborn sons in the household of the Jews will die? As you, as a mother or a father, wouldn't you wrap your baby and put them in a basket and put them in the river? So answering to your family, maybe from a biblical background, might open up a few thoughts.
There we go.
And then the last thing I would say is I'm not saying everyone gets to stay, but under international law, thank God, we let people have a chance to make their case. And so the great lessons we should have from when all the countries of the world shut their doors and turned their backs, what led to the creation of the Refugee Convention is acknowledgement this must be a national obligation of allowing an application, because otherwise it's too easy for all the nations of the world to simply look away.
I might just jump in here. It's Mary Crock. I think that was a beautiful answer to give Lenni, but what I would give you two pieces of advice. One is hard to say, because if people only listen to Fox News or other particular outlets, they actually have to believe what they're told. And so if you can approach this with a degree of compassion, you'll get further. But the point is, I think that these phenomenon, unfortunately, in some respects are being encouraged rather than dealt with, insofar as we have just seen with the midterm elections how effective the political framing of the caravan as threat has been, particularly in the southern states, with very, very close contests in Arizona, for example. It works politically. In my country, in Australia, the issue of irregular migration, of people coming by boats, literally has won government's election. And this is happening all over the world. If you look at the role that immigration has been playing in Brexit, in the election of your president, my prime ministers, plural. Sorry, it's not funny. The last comment I would make is, you know, when I was young, I used to get really hot under the collar. I used to stand up in public forums and scream at the speakers and get very upset. I threw my darling father out of our house one day because he was upset with the fact that I'd taken my new baby to a demonstration. Do you know what he taught me in his infinite wisdom? He was also a professor. He bequeathed me his title, I think. If you say, don't yell, show rather than tell, you'll get a lot further. So be gentle with your parents. They have to believe what they hear. You can show them. You can bring people home, but don't yell at them and don't get upset because, you know, this is all cyclical and we have to deal with what we have to deal with each day. People respond very differently to the embodied person next to them than they do to the idea. The politicians are really brilliant at creating the idea of the migrant as threat. Take them back to their lived experience. Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Grant Oswalker, and I'm from Oregon. And I want to know, when immigrant children came to the United States, do you know how they would get from their country to the United States?
I guess I answer. So I know the Americas case, and so my grandmother came in a ox-driven cart. They walked, is what I'm saying. Many of them walked. I also did later research on kids, Mexican kids who came after NAFTA and sort of came due to the consequences of NAFTA, which was signed in 1994. They came in the early 2000s. Some of them would take buses to an urban hub. In their case, it was Mexico City, and then take other buses to the border and then walk across. And so a lot of walking involved, but different modes of transportation.
Can I answer that question too? Yeah. I have done research on unaccompanied children who've come from all over the world to different countries. And the stories are incredible. With the children though, what each of them had in common was that they didn't get to choose where they were going. I went into a facility for unaccompanied children in Indonesia, and in a room of 15 young people, only one put up his hand to say, I chose, hey look, I've got a mobile phone that connects with a satellite. All the others said, well, we do what we're told. One of them said, my father gave my smuggler a ring, a signet ring. And he said, you don't get your money until you bring back that ring to prove, until you give that ring to my friend in this country, and he rings me to tell me that my son is safe. So they don't travel alone. They don't go always, sometimes they do, but they don't go just by themselves. Most of the time, young people are going because they're taken by grown-ups. Big, ugly grown-ups sometimes too.
We just have a couple of minutes, and I don't see another question, so...
Oh, wait, here comes Professor
Oh,
Hyde.
there we go.
He always has the million-dollar question.
I'm Alan Hyde. I teach immigration law. Is there any country in the world other than the U.S. that approaches refugee status determination as an adversary process in which the government has a lawyer to argue against asylum, but the asylum applicant has no lawyer provided? I tell my class that that's true, but I've always wondered if it's true. if I'm omitting some country that's equally unfair.
Look, asylum processes are different across different countries. One problem with the international law, and Pamela would know more about this than I do, is that the actual international convention doesn't say anything about the process that has to be followed. I think the US is fairly unique in having an adversarial process where you have a government lawyer and the child on the other side. Australia's process leaves a little to be desired too. however, particularly when people are flicked to remote desert other countries to be processed there. But even in Australia, we have a process where you have no right to representation, because we're told that if an applicant, if the person seeking asylum just answers the question, they don't need a lawyer. Have you heard that one before? What we have found, again, looking back at my research, is that almost universally, children who are not represented fail, and children who are represented through pro bono organisations like Safe Passage, Refugee Legal in Australia, and RACS and others, they actually succeed at very high rates.
So Julie, sorry if I say thank yous now. Can we do that?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you all again for coming, and I really appreciate that. Both the Dean and Sybil Shainwald did these beautiful introductions, but the reasons I wanted both of them to speak to you was not to talk about me, but to talk about their own generosity. New York Law School is housing the Safe Passage Project many, many years, absolutely no cost, very, very low nominal cost. They're generous in giving us access to these wonderful facilities, to working with me and Professor Thomas and other professors here in working with our students, with our alumni, with the larger community. There's 400 plus pro bono lawyers active right now, but over time there's been thousands. And so I think the dean really, and the whole administration and the faculty who share their hallways and their elevators with all these little people. I mean, you should hear Kenny, our main receptionist. He actually tells me it's one of the most favorite things of his day. He knows every law student's name, but I think he knows about half the children of Safe Passage Project's names as well. And then Sybil, this last year, she's been a devoted alumna of the school, but she took some funds that she was willing to give to the law school, and she really has been one of the main donors of our new asylum clinic. And I really appreciate that she's giving life and hope to so many people and experience to our students through that gift. So of course, all the staff who put on this event, the Alumni Affairs Office, the building staff, the technology people, the food is outside, I'm not gonna hold you up. But if you are thinking of, I wanna make a meaningful effort this year to save some lives, think about volunteering. You can find many different organizations in New York. You can go to the Safe Passage Project website and register as a potential volunteer. And think about making a Christmas gift, a Hanukkah gift, a year-end gift to New York Law School for scholarships, to the general fund, to our new asylum clinic, to Safe Passage Project. You get a tax deduction. You get happiness in your heart, and you make significant change. So thank you all for coming, and let's go have a glass of wine.